balancing immediate joy and long-term goals. Ever wondered how to effectively manage and prioritize a bucket list that evolves over time? Join the Bucketlist Accountant himself, David Patterson, as he discusses the essentials of setting and adjusting goals, celebrating achievements, and balancing long-term dreams with immediate desires. Discover practical strategies for evaluating and refining your bucket list periodically while learning how to stay flexible and handle competing priorities. Tune in for insights on making meaningful bucket list decisions that align with your personal journey and bring joy to your life. I'm your host, Anthony Pearl. Let's get into making your bucket list happen. David, I think one of the things that we really need to talk about is getting priorities right when it comes to your bucket list, and not just in sitting down initially and working those priorities, but how you actually manage a priority list that's going to change over time.
Yeah, there's a couple of things with a bucket list. One is a lot of people become a bit apprehensive when they first start it because they're worried about that their things that are on their bucket list aren't as important as or aren't as exciting as other people's lists, which is completely, it doesn't matter what is on someone else's list. It's the important thing is what's on your list and that it means something to you. And the other concept of it, which is part of the prioritizing, is that there's nothing wrong with over time things changing and your priorities changing and the things that are important to you changing. And so things may come off the bucket list that you've had on there that are no longer important for you to do. As a younger person, you may want a flash fancy sports car and start saving towards that, or have it on your list and have it up on your board. But life changes. You might get a partner, get kids, and then suddenly the Lamborghini or the Porsche or whatever it was you were aiming for becomes less important than other things, which is fine. The bucket list should be a dynamic document that changes over time, either because you've achieved your bucket list goal, or your life changes, your priorities change, and what was once important to you is less important, and it just drops down a little bit on the importance scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's always new things, isn't there, as well, that suddenly become bright and shiny for you for one reason or another. And so, how often are you kind of sitting down with clients and asking them to reevaluate their bucket list?
So we have probably once a year, we have a big reevaluation, because it's a bit like New Year's Eve, isn't it? You set your resolutions for the year. Once a year, we'll sit down and again, it's about celebrating what you've done and then resetting what you want to do. So once a year, we'll sit down and have a look at all the things that someone's ticked off their bucket list and, talk about it and celebrate that. And then start thinking about the things that you can add on to replace what you've done. But there's also a continuous once a quarter, looking at what's on the list and refining it continually as you go along. But once a year, we'll have a proper sort of sit down, look at it and realign the bucket list goals. But it does become a continual process for the clients, as they see something or as a shiny object comes into their vision, then they'll write that into their bucket list. So it's a constant live document that's forever changing.
Are there rules on how long the bucket list should be to be reasonable and to get it started?
I don't think so. I think you can have a bucket list as long as you want. I think that where it becomes important is the prioritizing of the importance of some of the things, because I don't like the idea of people dropping something off just because they've ended up with 2 pages of things that they've got on their bucket list. I think if your bucket list is 5 pages long, let's make it 5 pages long, because you just don't know what will happen in the past. And I think the visualization of having things written down, I think, is really important because you don't forget things. So I think the list can be as long as you want, but I think it then needs to be broken down and chunked down a little bit into timeframes and importance. So, the must-haves, the be nice to haves, and the rest to come after that. With I think the priority being, you've got to do as best you can, do the must-haves, and then the rest become a bit of a bonus.
I think that's a really tricky one, isn't it, as well? Working out the priority, because you can have, and we've spoken in previous episodes about working towards a large holiday, right? Which is a significant investment versus buying a new computer, for argument's sake, which is a lesser cost.
Yeah.
Getting the priorities right and working out, the must-have versus the want to have in the future, and knowing which ones you're working towards at any given time is that's the challenge, isn't it? Because you realize if you go, well, I've now saved, $3,000-4,000, so I can afford the computer, but that's now put me $3,000 or $4,000 behind the holiday if I take one or the other. So is it literally looking at it and trying to examine what's important at each point? Because how do you know which one you're really working towards at any given time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And again, you're right. You're going to have these competing elements throughout the journey. But again, this is where you've got to give yourself the permission to be a little bit flexible on these things as well. Like, it's not a rigid line of, if you've got a bigger goal of a holiday and then these smaller things along the way. And there's always going to be hiccups along the way as well. So I think part of this is that you've got to be prepared to be a little flexible as you go along and not get too upset if something pops up that kind of delays or defers the bigger item that you've got on your list. I think it just kind of roll with the punches a little bit as you're going along. But if you have got this goal at the end and something comes up, like you've got to buy a new, or you want to buy a new computer, or you have to buy a new one, and it puts you $3,000 behind, just take a step back and just reassess the bigger goal and say, well, is there something I can do now that allows me to catch that money up quicker? Is there a way that I can increase my sales, or is there a way that I can do something, or is there another item of cost that I can do without for a little while to get me back on track? And I think that becomes the important part.
Yeah, and so it is really important, isn't it? To how do you actually assess at any given point in time? Because the bright shiny thing is a good example, right? Today I've seen a new whatever, and suddenly I want it. I've got to have it, and suddenly it's like, you know what? I was thinking about this before. Damn that! I'm just going to move towards this thing, because the bright shiny thing is often one cause for you to completely reassess. How do you take a more measured approach to that and not just get sucked in by something bright and shiny? Because we all been guilty of that, right? We've all bought something on a whim, almost, and afterwards and gone, yeah, maybe, I'm enjoying it, but should I have? There's always that going around. This podcast is brought to you by bucketlistaccounting.com.au. Speak to David Patterson and his team if you want to take better control of your life and business, helping small business owners like you be successful designing the life of your dreams. Go to bucketlistaccounting.com.au or check out the show notes for more information. Now back to the program.
I've got a signed Nick Maxwell boot from the grand final that Collingwood won against St Kilda. Which was a whim purchase, which I wasn't able to resist, the bright and shiny, and it did put me back a little bit. But in hindsight, when I can glance over and look at it now, it does give me a nice little sense of it. It's lovely to have.
It didn't go to the pool room; it went to the office room.
It went to the. I wasn't allowed to take it home; it had to come to the office. So, but I think there's a short-term element and a longer-term element that you need to be able to look at, and short-term, that purchase was a mistake, but long-term, it's turned out okay. So I think as long as you can, and again, it's difficult, and every now and then, I think you should be able to give yourself a break and buy the shiny objects and just say, did I really need it? No, but it's a nice to have kind of thing. You've got to give yourself that break every now and then, but in general terms, I think if you can kind of sit back just a little bit and ask yourself the question, is that bright and shiny object is it going to bring you joy? Is it going to help you towards what you're trying to achieve? And is it going to impede on some of those other things that you've determined yourself are important to you? And then if the answer is yes, then maybe you put that aside, And I think this is where it becomes important to have that list written down and have it prioritized to say, yes, these are the things that are important to me, because you can forget about them. Like I said before, you can forget about those things that you want to do. And if you've got them in front of you and they're there and they're a reminder constantly, when the shiny object comes up, I think it gives you a moment of pause that you can reflect and go, do I really need it? Or is that more important than impacting on this other thing? And that it can probably help you make a decision a little bit better.
And prioritizing is such a difficult thing as well, because you also have to recognize that you don't just want to wait sometimes until saying, well, it's a priority, but I want to do it when I retire, for example, because what you don't know 10 years out from retirement, for argument's sake, is how you'll actually feel when you retire and what
Yeah.
other things will have happened between now and then. So priorities also have to be about working towards something more immediate, don't they? Where you can, and not, it's great working towards the long-term goals, but sometimes you need to have these things that reward. Otherwise, they're kind of meaningless on the list because you never get to them.
100%. And I think the journey, this is probably going to come across a little philosophical, I think, but the journey is probably just as important, or is just as important as the destination. So you can't sacrifice the now for the future. I mean, you potentially have to sacrifice a little bit, but you've still got to enjoy yourself. You still got to enjoy life. You still got to be doing things that you enjoy as you go along. And I think one of the things that you can do is, if you've put something on your list and you think that's something that you'll do in retirement, is to just maybe ask yourself a question and say, well, what would need to change for allowing me to do that sooner? Are there things that I can do that can bring that round the world trip, that, the $150,000 sports car, whatever the case may be? Is there something that I can be doing that can bring it forward so that I can enjoy it sooner? The answer may be no, so you put it there, but you may be able to work through and go, hey, you know what, we can bring that forward from 15 years' time to 10 years' time. I think it's a constant question that you need to ask, is because you don't want to put things off if you can help it. The more you can do quicker, I think the better off you'll be, and the more you'll be able to tick off in the long run. And I think sometimes we build a thought into our head that we can only do something at a certain point in time without thinking about what are the ways that we can make that happen earlier. It's similar to a business thing. Like if you're targeting $1 million turnover, to then start to think about, well, what would I need to do to make it a $10 million turnover? Are there things that I could do to 10x my business rather than just get it to $1 million? And it's just a matter of getting your brain to think about, are there options that we can take?
Yeah, I think it's and it's interesting too, isn't it? That and if you get there, it's trying to understand whether it's the right approach to take now or not. I remember personally that when I was in my early mid-20s, I made the decision to buy a particular car. It was, wasn't anything too fancy, but it was a particular car. And I remember commenting to my dad at the time, if I don't do this now, then, I'll find someone, I'll get married, we'll have kids, and that won't happen for the longest time.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that on one hand, I'm really glad I bought the car, but it would have easier to have been said, you know what, I should really put that money towards something else. So it's understanding when it's worthwhile to have that priority come to fruition now, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. And I think that's like a guilt that we impose on ourselves to say, yes, you could have, like the car, I don't know how much the car cost you, but you could have put that towards anything else. You could have put it into and saved for a house or do whatever. But I bet that the car that you had in the time you had it, you enjoyed it. you enjoyed driving it. And like you said, you look back now and you're glad you did it when you did it. So I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying it now rather than waiting. And back when I was, what was I, 22, I just finished uni, and a mate came to me and said, how about we go and live over in England for a period of time? And I said, yep, let's do it. And we started planning, and I went in to see my boss, and I was absolutely scared of what my boss was going to say. And I think I might have told you this, Anthony, before, but I was really scared of what he was going to say. So I walked into his office and I sat down and I said, I'm resigning, because he'd said, I want you to hang around for a while after you finish your degree. So I was really nervous, and I went in and I said, look, I'm resigning. Mark and I have decided that we're going to travel overseas and live in London for a period of time. And again, I'll never forget, he kind of sat back and he looked at me and he said, good on you. Well done. He said, that's something I wish I had have done when I was about your age, and I never did it. And he regretted that. And he would have been in his mid-50s at that stage. And he said, that's something that I've regretted ever since, because I didn't do it. And there's something about, the travel when you're young is a lot more reckless. You've got a lot less pressure, a lot less commitments than what you have when you're older. And so it was one of the regrets that he had. I could have done the same thing. I could have put money aside. I could have saved for a house. I could have, done whatever. But we decided to head off to England when we're 22. And again, I'll never forget it. So absolutely, you should always be looking at how soon you can do the things that are on your bucket list.
The Bucketlist Accountant podcast is brought to you by David Patterson and his team at Bucketlist Accountant. Go and visit their website for more information, details of course in the show notes. I'm Anthony Pearl, your host from Podcast Done For You. We look forward to having your company in the next episode.